Thank you, Darren, for the really nice introduction and everything you've done for me. And thank you to the committee and everyone who decided to show their support today, come hear me talk about my research. When I started my PhD, my interest was in statistical mechanics and soft matter physics. And Darren pitched this really great project to me, and I decided to come here. And so the title of my talk is Mechanical Properties of Semiconducting Polymers, from Molecular Simulations to Process Development. And this talk can be divided up into 3 segments. One is based on the computational prediction of the mechanical properties. The second section is developing new experimental techniques to characterize these properties. And then the third section is exploiting all of this knowledge that we've generated to make a new type of fabrication process for making thin films of these materials. So why do we care about the mechanical properties of semiconducting polymers? Traditional electronic devices are based on glass, metal, and silicon, which are all intrinsically hard and brittle materials. So everybody's got a cell phone in their pocket, and you can feel it because there's a mismatch in the stiffness between the cell phone and your skin. And so there's a push right now in industry to move towards things like flexible electronics. For example, this flexible phone from Samsung or this flexible photovoltaic device. The key thing here is that anything can be made flexible if it's sufficiently thin. So the next step in the development of electronics, we believe, is towards stretchable electronics. So this is an example of a stretchable light-emitting device and some various wearable sensing and display devices. And so the advantage of having a mechanically soft electronic material is that you can interface it directly with the human body, or you can make textile-based electronics and open up new types of form factors that weren't previously possible. So since my talk is going to be about the mechanical properties of polymers, so there's 3 approaches for making electronics stretchable. One is through random composites. So in this example, they took some silver nanoplates, and they put it into elastomer matrix, and allows it to perform some conductivity function while stretching. Another approach is to use metals that are patterned into these serpentine shapes, and then it's able to withstand mechanical deformation by nature of the geometry. And so you can make fully integrated circuits with this kind of approach. And then the third approach, which is going to be the focus of my talk, is using materials that are intrinsically stretchable, and so they perform both some electronic function and some mechanical function. And the advantage of this is that they can be processed using conventional printing techniques, and you can start to really get some rubber-like behavior. So just to get you guys all acquainted with the mechanical properties of polymers, this is a very old and rich field. And so just to get started, you can think about the mechanical properties of rubber. So typically, the way that this would be tested is with a pull tester. And you take your sample, you put it in between 2 clamps, and you yank it. And as you're pulling it up, you can measure the force, which you can turn into a stress just by dividing by area. And then the strain is just the fractional extension as you're pulling it. And so as you pull it, you generate this curve, a stress-strain curve, which characterizes the mechanical response. And so think about if you took a rubber band and you put it in the freezer, and you pull it out, and now you try to stretch it. And think about what's going to happen. It's going to stretch, and it's going to have a stress response to that strain, and then it's going to fracture. And the reason that it fractures is because the polymer chains are kind of frozen, and they can't rearrange and slide past one another, and so the bonds will break. But what happens is if you start to heat it up, it starts to get less stiff, so there's a drop in the tensile modulus, and it begins to be able to yield. So if you see this peak in the curve, that corresponds to something called the yield point, and that's where plastic deformation begins to occur. Now, as you continue to heat it, you get into this regime, which is called the glass transition regime, and there's a specific temperature where you really start to see rubber-like behavior. So in this case, right below the glass transition temperature, you have a phenomena called cold drawing, where the polymer chains are able to move and extend, but they can't relax back to their original state. As you surpass the glass transition temperature, this is where you really see rubber, a rubber-like response. And so when you stretch it, the polymer chain, it becomes extended. And when in its extended state, it has less entropy. There's less statistical microstates that it can access. And so the random motion of all the other polymers hitting into it actually produce a restoring force, and that's the basis of rubber elasticity. So if you actually take a weight and you hang it from a rubber band, and then you raise the temperature, it's going to pull the weight up more, which is counterintuitive to many other types of elasticity. So semiconducting polymers are not rubber, and they're very different from traditional polymers that you would think of. And the distinguishing characteristics are that they have this pi conjugated backbone that consists of alternating single and double bonds, and that opens up a band gap and allows for charge transport along the backbone. Now that also makes it so that these chains are very stiff, and they don't like to dissolve into a solvent. So people add these flexible side chains, which increases the entropy of mixing and allows you to process them from solution like an ink. So this material in particular, P3HT or poly-3-hexylthiophene, is the fruit fly of organic semiconductors. It's like the most traditionally studied model system. As you can see, we compiled all the publications in this area, and P3HT takes up more than half the publications. And while it's a good model system, there's actually reasons why it's not perfect. So when you're processing these materials, what you do is you dissolve it in a solution. For example, chlorobenzene or chloroform. Generally it's a chlorinated solvent, and you cast it into a film. And when you cast it, it generally forms into an amorphous structure that lacks order. And what you can do is you can heat it up. And certain materials, when you heat it up, it stays amorphous. And this depends on the molecular structure. Materials, when you heat it up, it starts to form these semi-crystalline domains with local short-range order. And some materials, you can heat them up further, and they have long-range crystalline order. So P3HT in particular tends to form somewhere in between these two. So it's not really, really long-range semi-crystalline order, but it's there. And so the semi-crystalline materials, while they're good electronically, they are not very good mechanically. They're generally quite brittle. So for our case, we didn't want to just use one model system, one fruit fly. In biology, there's tons of animals that they use as model systems. So we're also going to discuss other molecules like this one with the off-axis conjugated units that kind of looks like a cockroach. Or this material that has this asymmetric fluorine group that introduces some randomness that looks kind of like a zebrafish, or it doesn't really look like that. I'm just using animals because I don't want to say the acronyms out loud. It's a mouthful. And then there's these more semi-crystalline materials like the monkey and the parrot. And I'm really going to restrict my talk to these kinds of amorphous materials because that's what we're interested in for mechanically compliant devices. So as can be expected, the semiconducting polymers are not equally plastic. There's a broad range of mechanical behavior, and there's also a broad range of electronic behavior. But what has been seen experimentally is there's actually a competition between electronic performance and mechanical compliance. And so at this point, the development of mechanically robust devices is still a materials challenge. We just simply don't have the materials to make really good devices. And so I'm going to introduce some figures of merit that will allow me to talk about these properties. So I already talked about the elastic modulus as a measure of stiffness. And generally we want to make a material that has a low stiffness. The glass transition temperature characterizes the mechanism by which it'll fail. And generally we want to have a low glass transition temperature. So at room temperature it will behave rubbery, or at least have that cold drawing behavior. And crack onset strain is where you have actual catastrophic failure. And we want to increase the crack onset strain, obviously. And finally, yield point is the onset of plastic deformation. So we also want to increase the yield point. And then on the optoelectronic side, you have figures of merit such as the charge carrier mobility, the photovoltaic conversion efficiency, and various optical absorption, emission properties. So the goal is really to design co-optimized materials with good electronic performance and mechanical performance. And it's actually quite a challenging problem because there's relevant phenomena that's occurring on many scales. Starting at the molecular scale, we have the ability to tune the structure through the powers of synthetic chemistry. And so you can do things like change the rings along the backbone, the size of the side chains, and you can control the length of the polymer chain. And then moving up a scale, you can look at the polymer properties and how they interact with one another, how they dissolve in solution, and then how they pack in a solid state. And even further up, generally devices would be made with multiple layers of thin film. So you have to look at the interaction between multiple thin films and the mechanics that occur there at the continuum scale. So when I started research here, the lab had developed a bunch of characterization techniques for the continuum scale, but we were really interested in understanding what was going on at the nano and meso scale. And the important question that I sought out to try to address during my PhD was how does the molecular structure and processing conditions influence the nanoscale morphology and mechanical behavior of these materials. And the technique that I chose to do it is called molecular dynamics. So molecular dynamics is just the numerical solution to Newton's equation of motion for molecules. And so a system of n interacting molecules has a total energy that can be written as the sum of the kinetic energy and the potential energy. And you can apply Newton's second law in the presence of a conservative force field. The force is just the negative gradient of the potential energy, which is just like a ball rolling downhill. For a molecular system, you have various different interaction parameters. You have two-body bonds between particles that we treat generally as harmonic springs. You have the three-body angular interactions, which are also generally treated as harmonic springs. And then you have four-body dihedral interactions, which is like a rotation about this axis. And these are particularly important for semiconducting polymers because you have these conjugated rings along the backbone, and so their dynamics are very much influenced by the rotations about those rings. And then finally, you have intermolecular forces from van der Waals and electrostatics. And so if you take this recipe and you give everything some motion, it'll start to move. And so polymers like to gyrate. They have molecular motion. And so there's a statistical property associated with them called the radius of gyration, which is a measure of the size. And so every time you see those angular brackets, that means that I'm averaging. And it's a statistical property that I'm calculating. And there's another property called the end-to-end vector, which describes it's a vector that points from one end to the other. And so now that we've got a good basis for understanding what these simulations are doing, I'll start with a little history of what has been done before I started. So back in 2010, the first really good atomistic simulations of our model system, P3HT, were performed. And in this case, this shows a melt. So the polymer, the glass transition temperature. And the simulation box is periodic. So if a polymer goes out one end, it'll come back in the other. And so more recently, actually right when I was starting my research, there was this paper that came out where they actually directly computed the stress strain properties of P3HT. And they got some interesting results, but it wasn't perfect. So you see that these are the really high molecular weight chains. They're very long. And you see this curve here. You see how it goes all the way up? That's very unphysical. That means there's something going wrong in the simulation. And essentially what's happening is the polymer chains are so long that they wrap in and out of the simulation box, and it puts a lot of strain on the chains, which can't break because you have a harmonic bond. And so the limitation really was that you couldn't simulate large enough systems to capture these high molecular weight effects. And so one of their conclusions was that large coarse-grained simulations, especially with chain lengths greater than the entanglement length, and accurate dihedral parameters are required. So I took that as my challenge to do my first project. And so what is a coarse grain model? So these atomistic simulations are very computationally expensive. You're running them on a supercomputer, either 100 CPUs or a couple GPUs, and they could take up to a month to do. And people don't really want to sit around and wait that long. So there's this technique called coarse graining where you'll run some atomistic simulations of a small scale system and you calculate a variety of statistical properties. And then you map groups of atoms into these superatoms or coarse grain sites. And that allows you to do more computationally efficient simulations and simulate much bigger systems. And so the important question that I wanted to ask was which coarse grain mapping captures the salient molecular and morphological features that determine the mechanical response of these materials. And so I investigated these two models, the three-site model, where each monomer is mapped to 3 coarse grain beads, and it preserves some of that anisotropy of the monomer structure. And then you also have this one-site model where each monomer is just a single coarse grain bead. So another nice thing about the coarse grain models is that you can actually simulate processes that are relevant to experiments. So as I said, these materials are generally cast from a solution. So the first thing I tried to do was simulate that solution processing. And so this is a video that shows how the polymers move around while the solvent is evaporating and they're forming a solid, thin film. And to do this, I used a technique called Langevin dynamics. And this implicitly includes the interactions with the solvent molecules through a drag force that depends on the velocity of the atoms and a random force that follows a delta-correlated stationary Gaussian process, which is just a fancy way of saying it has no memory in time and the average value is 0. And for this case, since we had all the experimental results, we copied them exactly. So we're using the same molecular weight that we had the experiments for, and we used the same solvent that we were doing in the lab. And so once you generate this simulation morphology, you can compute the mechanical response directly by just pulling it. And in order to calculate the stress, you just calculate this instantaneous virial stress tensor, which you can average and get a bulk mechanical response. And in this case, we apply a 0 stress boundary condition in the transverse directions, so it can also compress in those directions, and you can calculate something called the Poisson ratio. So let me just give a comparison of the findings from both these models. If you look just at the morphology that forms, there's a pretty substantial difference. The one-site model we see actually packs much more densely than the three-site model, and it also looks more amorphous, whereas the three-site model has more of this disordered aggregate morphology. And then if we compute the mechanical response, we also see a pretty big difference. So the one-site model predicts a very soft response, while the three-site model is much stiffer. And that's a little bit counterintuitive because the one-site model has a higher density. So generally things with a higher density also have a higher modulus. And if you compare to experiments, you see all around the three-site model does a much better job. And the reason for this is because it preserves that anisotropy of the monomer structure. And so for the rest of the talk on the coarse grain simulations, I'll be discussing the results from the three-site model, because that one-site model, while it could be useful for other things, is insufficient to describe the mechanical response.
I have a question here. So did you compare your three-site model, at least for shorter polymer length, with the one from
yeah, so
Atomistic Simulation?
I didn't compare it to the, so pretty much, for the modulus at least,
yeah.
It's all the same pretty much. It doesn't vary as much with the molecular weight, but the actual stress strain curve is different. And we have a paper where I did the stress strain response as a function of molecular weight directly in collaboration with my colleague Daniel, who is measuring them. And so we see good agreement there.
So here you are actually able to do that. The atomistic one was done by Tamala?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So these simulations show a pure polymer, but a lot of the times, especially in the case of an organic solar cell, you mix it with another molecule, in this case a small molecule that's a fullerene. And what we've seen experimentally is that that fullerene acts as an anti-plasticizer. So what does that mean? It makes it stiffer and more brittle. And that's generally not what we want. So we wanted to see if these coarse grain models could predict this experimental observation. And what we did find that it could. So you can see in the stress strain curve that the composite system is stiffer, and it also has less area under this curve, which means that it's weaker. It has less mechanical toughness. Another thing I'd like to point out is that you see actually a change in the shape of the curve, and that corresponds to a transition it goes from a glass transition above room temperature or below room temperature to one above room temperature. And so we can calculate the glass transition temperature directly from the simulations as well. All you have to do is monitor the density as a function of temperature while you're quenching them, and you can find the glass transition as the region in which the thermal expansion coefficient exhibits a discontinuity. And the reason that the glass transition temperature gets lowered is because the fullerene molecules have very strong intermolecular forces, and they slow down the dynamics of polymer chains. And this was confirmed with neutron scattering experiments. So we have good agreement with experiments for density, modulus, yield point, and glass transition temperature. So now we want to look at things that are not as easy to study experimentally. And so, as I mentioned before, the radius of gyration describes the size of the polymer chains. And what we found is that in the composite system, the polymer chains tended to be much smaller. So they were folding on themselves and forming more of these coil structures instead of being more extended. And we would expect that if the chains are smaller, they're not going to entangle as well. So entanglement's a very important property of polymers that gives them these unique mechanical properties. So we wanted a way of calculating the number of entanglements in the simulation. So this is two chains that were just taken directly out of the simulation, and there's an entanglement in them. And you guys can try to scan along and see if you can find it. But it actually turns out to be quite a difficult problem to find or define what an entanglement is. So we can borrow some concepts from the field of topology. So there is this concept that was introduced about 10 years ago or 15 years ago called a primitive path. And it describes the minimum path that a polymer chain can be reduced without violating a topological constraint. So imagine the polymer chain in 2 dimensions, and all of these little black spots are obstacles that it can't cross through. And so the primitive path just means you get rid of all these excess loops that don't entangle with anything. They're not topologically constrained. And so the way that you calculate it is you fix the endpoints, and then you scan along the chain until you hit an obstacle. And then you mark that point, and it's called an interior kink. And you continue that algorithm, and you can go all the way along, and you can calculate this primitive path. And so these interior kinks are proportional to the number of entanglements, or they're a measure of entanglements. And they're not all equal. So the ones at the ends are weaker. They're not as strongly as entangled. And the primitive path really describes what would happen if you tried to pull the polymer from this angle. It would condense onto that primitive path. That's the way that, because polymers move like snakes, they kind of reptate. And so they reptate along the primitive path. And so you can apply the algorithm to the 3-dimensional system, and you can see, yes, indeed, these polymer chains are entangled. And what we found was that there's 3 times more entanglements in the pure polymer system than there was in the composite. And this is due to 2 effects. For one, if you have fullerenes in there, there's a lower density of polymer chains, so that's going to reduce the entanglements. And then the other effect is that the polymer chains partially phase segregate and they fold on themselves, so they're not as extended, so they're also going to be less entangled due to that. So we've got some good explanations for our experimental findings. And I wanted to take this a step further with these coarse grain models. So I made this really, really big simulation that shows a 40 nanometer thick thin film under tensile loading. And so the colors here show the stress that gets concentrated to individual polymer chains. So P3HT, as I said, is an important model system, but it's really not the only one. It's not generally considered the future of organic semiconductors. So the next project that I embarked on was to simulate some of these more complex polymers, the other part of the zoo of materials that are available. And so nobody had actually ever simulated the condensed phase of these materials yet. So in order to start, I started in the same place that they had with P3HT. You start in the melt, well above the glass transition temperature, and that's when things can move around. So this shows how they're moving around in the melt. And in this case, simulating 60 polymers that are each 12 units long. And that's right around the entanglement length. And the pure polymer simulations have 100,000 atoms, while the bulk heterojunction has about 150,000 atoms. So that's about the scale that things are happening. And then, as you can see, it's kind of a mess of a simulation. It's amorphous, it lacks structure, and so you need a way of characterizing it. And so you can define an orthonormal basis for each one of these monomer units that describes like the direction and orientation. And you can also do this coarse grain mapping for the purpose of analysis, so you can see how the different units stack with one another. And so you can compute a lot of interesting things. For example, this shows the probability distribution of these dihedral angles between the conjugated rings. And then also you can compute things like how do these different chemical units stack with respect to one another? How do they tend to pack? And this is called a pair distribution function. And so all these statistics that you can calculate can be used to make a coarse grain model for these materials in theory. So the next step was to generate a glassy solid morphology. And in doing this, you can also predict the glass transition temperature. So you start with these simulations in the melt. So this shows a plot of density versus temperature. And then you gradually cool it. And in this region, there's an inflection, and that marks that glass transition. And so where available, we did see good agreement between this and experiment. But as I'll explain in further detail later, it was actually quite a tricky thing to measure for these materials. And so the morphology that I made in this way, I'll call the melt-quenched morphology and the bulk heterojunction morphology. So they're just taken out of these simulations directly at this point. Now, since these materials are glassy and you're casting them from solution, they really depend on their structure in solution. So there is some experimental evidence that suggested that these materials form aggregated structures in solution. And in order to characterize this, I performed these simulated annealing experiments, or simulations, where you start with a chain isolated at high temperature, and you gradually lower the temperature. And as you're lowering the temperature, energy begins to play a more important role than entropy, and they form these minimum energy structures. And what I found was that there's 4 conformational classes that these materials could fall into. There's this disordered globular structure. There are these more ordered toroidal and folded structures, and then there's this unaggregated extended structure. And so each one of these materials could form any of those conformations, but they did so in different amounts. And so we needed a way of classifying which conformations they fell into. And to do this, I used something called a Landau-Dijen Q-tensor order parameter, which essentially just the maximum eigenvalue of that matrix describes the order present in that structure. And when I'm talking about order, I'm talking about the tangent vectors to the polymer. So in the case of a folded conformation, they're all pointing along that direction. And so the eigenvector for this matrix would point in that orientation. And so a useful visualization of this Q-tensor is these orientational contact maps. So you can see the difference very clearly between the toroidal and the folded, where you have the blocky shape versus the diagonal. And so using this and the end-to-end distance, I was able to classify which structures were obtained. And what we saw was that the most ordered material had the strongest tendency to fold. The least ordered material had the strongest tendency to form globular structures, and the intermediate one was intermediate. So the likelihood for a polymer to obtain one of these minimum energy conformations depends on a balance of the bending stiffness of the polymer chain and the intermolecular forces between the pi conjugated units. And so there was a recent review where one of the section headers where they asked the question, are conjugated polymers rigid rods, Gaussian coils, or worm-like chains? And the way that you can calculate this from a simulation is through something called a tangent correlation function, which just describes how the tangent vector decays as you move along the backbone of the polymer. And so a Gaussian coil, the tangent correlation function is just 0. There's no correlation. For a rigid rod, the tangent correlation is just 1. It's completely correlated. And then a worm-like chain is in between, and it has this exponential decay. And that's characterized by a persistence length, which is a measure of the stiffness of the polymer chain. Now, just to give you an idea of the magnitude of the persistence length, polyethylene, which makes up like grocery bags, has a persistence length of 1 nanometer, whereas DNA has a persistence length of 50 nanometers. So that's about the range that you can get. And so I calculated this property from the simulations, and what I found was that actually none of the above models applied. Instead, we saw that there was an oscillation in the decay in the tangent correlation function, both in the melt, in the bulk heterojunction, and in solution. And so this was a little bit confusing for me when I saw it. I was like, huh, why is that happening? And I did some literature searching, and what I found was that that oscillatory decay is characteristic of a ribbon, not a worm. And so there's this extra cosine that comes to the tangent correlation. And so this was actually analytically derived. And there's this extra term, which is of the length scale for the folding of the polymer chain. And so this was something new that people hadn't really discussed. Field. Everyone always assumes a worm-like chain for all the interpretation of scattering data. And so I think it could potentially have a lot of important implications both for the charge transport through these systems and also how they respond mechanically, because now it might not behave as an entropic spring. It might be something different. And that's really not well understood at this point. It also could affect the entanglements. So I would expect that the ribbon-like nature would decrease the number of entanglements, but the ones that are there are stronger maybe because they coil on each other. So this was a pretty exciting finding, but it's still tangent to the central task of my thesis, which is the mechanical properties. So in order to study the mechanical properties of these materials, I generated 3 different morphologies. Because they're glassy and it depends on their structure. One was prepared by quenching from the melt-quench morphology. The other one is called the self-aggregated morphology. And this is due to the fact that a lot of these materials will aggregate in solution. And so if what I did was I just took those aggregated chains that were outputted from the previous simulation and I packed them together at room temperature. So they were not able to relax and they formed these voids. We expect this to be much less mechanically robust than the melt-quenched morphology. And then we also wanted to look at the bulk heterojunction. And so when we computed the stress-strain properties of this, we found something that was pretty interesting. Actually, it really depended much more on the morphology than it did the actual molecular structure. And this kind of made us step back and say, well, the molecular structure affects the mechanical properties to the extent that it affects the structure in solution. So it helped us to kind of unentangle those competing effects. And so when we compare it to experiment, we see that the modulus predicted by the melt-quenched and the self-aggregated morphology form bounds for the actual experimental results, which are some combination in between those 2 extreme cases. And so these were pretty exciting results. They made us pretty confident in these models. So I wanted to take it a step further and study this material, PDB7, in further detail. So the hypothesis that I want to test here is how does the ribbon-like nature of PDB7 affect the mechanical response? And at the same time, I also want to look at the effect of polydispersity, so a distribution of molecular weights on the entanglements and mechanical response. So this is actually a simulation that I have running right now. Even in the 3.5 years that I've been here, supercomputers have gotten so much better. And instead of doing 100,000, now I could do 1 million. So it allows me to really study new phenomena. And the first thing I was able to calculate from this, the simulation is still running, so I don't have a lot of results on it yet, but I wanted to see if that oscillatory nature of the tangent correlation function persisted for high molecular weights. And not only did it persist, it actually becomes more pronounced, which I think is very interesting. And so I'm very excited to see what the results of these simulations are going to yield. So all of the algorithms, models, and methods that I've used to make these simulations, with the help of CJ and Andrew, I've encapsulated this into open source Python code that can do this whole slew of simulations where you start with quantum mechanical calculations to make these atomistic models, and then you could do atomistic molecular dynamics and get all these statistical properties and eventually get coarse-grained models. So this area right here is really the part that's not really finished yet. It's quite challenging, actually, especially for these complex structures to make coarse-grained models, because if you have like 11 different interaction sites, it's 11 factorial different parameters that you have to calculate. But I think actually there's some potential here for machine learning algorithms to make these coarse-grained models. This is essentially the end of the segment on the computational part of my PhD research. And now I'm going to go to some discussion of experiments. So one of the things that I was quite frustrated by about mid-PhD was that I couldn't compare the predictions that I had for TG with experiments, because we simply didn't have the experimental results for a lot of materials. And the problem was that conventional techniques such as differential scanning calorimetry just were not able to detect this subtle transition. And this was a problem that was kind of facing the field, and I discussed it with a lot of people at conferences, and it was just a well-known problem that we couldn't measure the glass transition. But there is something that we did know, and that when you spin coat a film from solution, it has some UV-vis absorption spectrum. And when you anneal it, there's a change in the UV-vis absorption spectrum. So the formation of those ordered regions changes the absorption. And so looking at this graph that produced by Kim and coworkers, I thought, what if we use the change in the UV-vis spectrum to estimate the glass transition temperature? And around this time, I was TAing a polymer class, and I convinced this amazing student to help me out with this project, Mohammed. And I convinced him that this was a hypothesis worth testing. So he did all the experiments for this. I just gave him the idea and some guidance. But so we wanted to look at the change in the UV-vis absorption. And to do that quantitatively, I defined this thing that I call a deviation metric, which just gives you this it reduces this vector into a scalar, essentially, just to describe the deviation from the as-cast film to the annealed film. And the way these experiments work is you start with an as-cast film and you do UV-vis. And then you anneal it, and then you do UV-vis again, and you anneal it, and you do UV-vis again, you anneal it, and then you get this kind of curve. And although these changes in the absorption might look small here, when you apply that deviation metric, you see that there's an inflection right at the experimentally determined TG using other methods. So there are other methods that you can use to measure TG. We just didn't have access to them. So it became a challenge of validating this method. And so we found, the advantages that this method has is that it only requires a small amount of material, which these materials are very precious. They take a long time to synthesize, and if you buy them, it's like $1,000 for 200 milligrams. So, and it uses only commonly available equipment, and it measures thin film TG, not a bulk value, and those are not necessarily the same. And so we wanted to further validate it by applying to other molecules for which the other people had measured the glass transition temperature, and we wanted to see if it would work. And so what we found was that there is this direct correlation, one-to-one, between what we measured with our technique and what other groups have measured. And another group actually even took our technique and used a cryostat and showed that it works below room temperature as well. So we wanted to look at it in a little bit more detail, so I did some simulations to show what's happening. So when you start in this as-cast morphology, it's loosely packed, there's these voids, and as you start to heat it up and you get to the glass transition temperature, you see this inflection. And that's when the polymer chains get enough thermal energy to start moving around and filling in the voids. There is one caveat with the technique, although I think it is surmountable. It really only works for materials that form these local aggregates and semi-crystalline, because those are the ones that really change their absorption property when you anneal them. But I think that it would work if you were able to do it in situ with amorphous materials. And that's something that I'm hoping I can convince someone to test out. So while the glass transition temperature is really important, it's also not directly related to, or it's not the mechanical response. So how do we measure the mechanical properties of these materials? We're talking about thin films that are 100 nanometers thick. You can't manipulate them with your hands. You can't put them into a pull tester. So instead, what we do is we laminate it onto an elastomer and we stretch it under a microscope. And what we see is that there's two different fracture mechanisms that can occur. You have this brittle fracture where the film bifurcates all the way across, and then you have this ductile fracture mechanism where it starts at a defect and it forms this diamond shape, and that propagates as you strain it. So brittle fracture in thin films is well characterized, it's well understood. There exists a technique where you strain it past the crack onset and you measure the density of cracks, and that allows you to calculate the modulus through the wrinkles that form and the crack onset strain and the fracture stress. But this technique really only works for brittle, low molecular weight materials. And the materials that we're interested in fail in this way, which is a much less understood fracture mechanism. So we wanted to study it in more detail. And I really like this idea of pulling it past failure and seeing how it responded. So I, again, convinced Mo this was a good project to do. And what we found was that the aspect ratio of these voids increased linearly with strain. And the reason that we think that this is happening is because there's this plastic dissipation zone that prevents the film from fracturing. And we also think that the length scale of this plastic zone is determined by the length of this characteristic X shape that forms. And to test that, we did a simple experiment where we just strained it till it's fractured, and then we released some of the strain. You see that it wrinkles in these areas, which indicates plastic deformation, and it doesn't in here, which means there's some partial elastic recovery. And in this region, we expect the molecules to kind of look something like this, where they've strained, but they don't have, these materials are glassy, so they can't go back with entropic elasticity. So we defined the microvoid propagation number as the slope of this linear regression, and we think it's a more rigorous metric for failure in ductile thin films because it eliminates some of the experimenter bias associated with, because these voids initiate at defects, and it really depends where you're looking at the film, what you're going to measure, the crack onset strain. But it wasn't completely satisfying to us because this parameter M is dimensionless. It doesn't have any energy term in it. So we wanted to see how it compared to more traditional metrics of ductile failure. And so what we did was these very delicate experiments. Actually, Kristan did these. These are very difficult to do. But what you do is you take the film and you float it onto water, and then you strain it. And what we found was that this microvoid propagation number, the logarithm of the microvoid propagation number, was proportional to the fracture stress. So we see that it is related to more traditional metrics of failure, but it's actually more relevant because you'd never have a film floating on water. And it's also easier to do. And we also did these other experiments, introduced a notch, and then watched how the cracks propagate. And we also see a qualitative correlation between the results of that and the microvoid propagation number. So what I've shown you thus far is a lot of fundamental results, but what is it actually good for? So something that motivates us in the Lipomi lab is this idea of a solar tarp. So a tent-like solar cell that can be unfurled in the event of an emergency or in the developing world to provide power and shelter. And as I've explained already, when you add this fullerene molecule, it generally makes the materials very brittle. No matter the polymer, it's going to be brittle. And so we want to use, instead, an electron-accepting polymer. And so this one in particular, we found can strain up to 20% without cracking. And then when we mix it with this material, this was the zebrafish, it can go up to 50% without exhibiting any cracks. So that's the materials that we want to use. And it could be other combinations of polymers, but the main idea is not to use PCBM. And another challenge, especially for a solar tarp, is how do you coat this really uniform 100 nanometer thick film onto the irregular surface of a textile? And this could also be useful for textile-based electronics. And the idea to do this came from an observation that our founding father, Ben Franklin, made. So what he found was that if you put a drop of oil onto the surface of a pond, the waves in the distance are quelled. And the reason that's happening is because it spreads out. So if you take a volatile polymer solution and you put it on the surface of water, it spontaneously spreads out as long as this spreading parameter, which depends on the surface tension, is greater than 0. And it forms this molecularly thin film at the surface. And so this other group showed that this technique could be used in a batch way to make solar cells. And the surprising result that they had was that the solar cells they made in this way were actually better than those made with a spin coater in air, which is a more traditional way of making it. And the reason that they claimed that it worked better is because it's drying faster and there's less time for oxygen to get in, which degrades the performance. So this is potentially a scalable air processing technique for making high quality thin films, but the way that they did it is inherently batch. And so we wanted to make it into a continuous process. And the idea to do this, which we call interfacial drawing, is you take this trough and you have a roll and you deposit the polymer solution and it spreads out and forms a meniscus over here at the edge. And if you pull on the film and you replenish the meniscus, you can get a stable process where you're producing a thin film in a continuous manner. And so I wanted to show that this was possible. So the first idea was to deposit it onto these commercially available flexible electrodes. And so this is a picture of the apparatus that I built in operation. And so you can see this really highly uniform film at the surface of water. And this is a picture of the film after I took it off the apparatus. And you can measure the thickness with UV-vis if you calibrate it properly. And this shows the film on the flextrodes. Now, this is really still a work in progress, and while we have measured the photovoltaic effect in these materials, they're by no means efficient, and there's a lot more optimization that needs to be done. And it really happens that this project is like a chemical engineer's dream. It's got like everything in it. It's got fluid mechanics, it's got mass transport, mechanical properties. So it turns out that if you use glassy materials, it forms wrinkles at the surface. So you really need to be concerned with viscosity, all these different dimensionless numbers. And so it's a really exciting project. And it's going to be continued after I leave by Rory. So just to conclude and summarize my thesis research, I started by building a molecular simulation code for trying to understand the mechanical behavior of these materials. And that kind of led to this discovery of a ribbon-like chain. And then I developed 2 new characterization techniques for measuring mechanical properties, and finally applied this fundamental knowledge to make a new type of process. So I really couldn't have done all this on my own. I need to thank Darren, who's probably definitely the most important mentor I've ever had, aside from my mom, of course, and the Lipomi group as a whole. I've had lots of collaborators. Professor Gaurav Arya was very helpful for me in the beginning to talk to about molecular simulations, and all of the members of the Lipomi lab, and also the funding sources. So I got nice funding from ARCS and Corning that has made my lifestyle as a graduate student pretty comfortable, actually. And these are the publications that form the chapters of my thesis. This is mainly for the committee. And luckily, working in the Lipomi lab, I also had the opportunity to work on a variety of other projects. So one was with mainly Alex Zaretsky and Brandon Marin, who were both really important mentors to me in the lab and helped me get my hands dirty after I'd been doing simulations for 2 years. And so this project was looking at the self-assembly of metallic nanoislands on the surface of graphite vapor deposition. There is also another project, which unfortunately we haven't published on yet, but it's the development of these stretchable transparent barriers to protect these organic photovoltaic films. And then finally, this new area of the lab, haptics, I had the opportunity to work on this I had an idea to make this new type of electrical stimulation device for providing a user feedback and a haptic response. And these are the publications that were not in my thesis. So at this point, I'd be happy to answer any questions. And thanks everybody for coming and listening.